Today, I have the honor and the privilege to profile one of my favorite characters in tattoo culture. Back when I first started getting into tattoos in the late 90s, I read an article about Tony Polito in one of the tattoo magazines. It described his shop, and I clearly remember the picture of him with that big bracelet that said, Old Calcutta. And I read about the way he worked. That stuck with me. Tony wasn't just another tattooer. He was a character, someone who carried himself differently. And there's one design that always comes up when people talk about him. A skull in a cowboy hat and scarf. You've probably seen it, maybe even on skin or flash walls. But here's the problem. Most people don't know its real name, the Rough Rider. Today, it's more likely to be mislabeled as the Crazy Sal, a name Tony would have hated. What's worse, a lot of people don't even connect the design back to Tony at all, and I think that's wrong. He didn't draw it at first, but he made it famous. He's the reason it's remembered. This video is about setting the record straight, about Tony Polito, about the Rough Rider, and about the shop that everyone called Old Calcutta. Welcome to Skin and Story. Anthony Polito was born in Brooklyn, 1945. He got his first tattoo at just 14. It was 1959 from a local tattooer called Frisco Frank. That year would follow him forever, because Tony signed everything he ever drew with 1959. Flash sheets, posters, even decades later. Old Calcutta, 1959. But here's the important part. Tony is thought to have started tattooing right around 1964. Like much of his career, the timeline isn't exact. What we have are memories, scattered accounts, and stories from people who knew it. 1964 is the best marker we can point to, but it's not definitive. The signature was branding, not a timestamp. Tony's apprenticeship story is simple. There wasn't one. He was self-taught. As a teenager, he tattooed at home and later out of his parents' house. He picked up tips from tattooers on the Bowery, like the Moskowitz brothers and Huck Spalding, but nobody ever took him under their wing. He figured it out for himself. Rich Fie remembered Tony telling stories about those early days, tattooing his little friends in the park and in the parky house, even running power from a lamppost. Whether it was true or part of Tony's showman streak, it paints a picture of just how scrappy and determined he was starting out. I remember reading about Tony back in the late 90s, and I always admired him. The style, the grit, the way he carried himself. In 1961, New York City outlawed tattooing, Article 181. Officially, it was because of a hepatitis scare with approximately 15 cases. Unofficially, it was about controlling spaces that city officials saw as dirty or dangerous. For tattooers like Tony, it meant working in the shadows. Shops ran after hours, health inspectors and police could show up at any time. Rich Fie, Tony's friend years later, described how the shop would only open after 5 in the evening, and how Tony worked behind bulletproof glass to keep the risks at bay. Imagine that for a second. You walk into a Brooklyn apartment or a storefront, it smells like smoke and green soap, and your tattooer is behind a sheet of bulletproof glass. That was the reality of New York tattooing in the band years, and Tony made it work. In 1970, Tony tried something different. He signed a 1-year lease on a shop on State Street in Chicago. He didn't like it. He said the scene was too gangster. Everybody had guns. Everyone felt like trouble. After a year, he packed it in. In 1971, he moved again, this time to Conyers, New York. That experiment ended even worse. Another tattooer firebombed the shop. Tony told Rich the place burned down after someone tossed a Molotov cocktail through the window. That was the reality of tattoo at the time. By 1972, he was back in Brooklyn. And for a time, he was the only tattooer in New York City still working during the ban. Think about that. One man holding down an entire city's tattoo culture. That was Tony Polito. Back in Brooklyn, Tony's shop became infamous for its pace. He wasn't putting out a handful of tattoos a week. He was doing 40 tattoos a day, every day. And there's at least one record of him doing 80 in a single day. How is that even possible? Tony's nephew Willie would outline tattoos all day long. Then Tony would move down the line, coloring them in. Clients would be waiting with fresh outlines, bleeding and wrapped, while Tony worked his way through the stack. It was production tattooing at a speed most artists today could barely imagine. This wasn't delicate, slow, fine line work. This was bold, quick, traditional tattooing, built to last and built to move. And that's what really sticks with me. The intestinal fortitude it took to keep working through the band years. Behind bulletproof glass, with inspectors breathing down your neck, that's something special. It's not hard to admire that. Tony didn't just keep tattooing. He kept the culture alive. Now let's talk about the cowboy skull, the design most people associate with Tony Polito, and the one that became infamous as the Crazy Sal. Here's the truth. Tony didn't invent it. The cowboy skull first appeared on a pulp novel from 1936 called Death at a Dude Ranch. It was later seen in The Flash of Cap Coleman, one of the great Virginia tattooers. Later, Spalding and Rogers. We have a whole video on Paul Rogers. You should check it out. Spalding and Rogers were giants in the mail order supply world. They put out a version. Tony copied that sheet, and that's the one that ended up on the walls at Tony's Tattoos. Tony may not have drawn it first, but he was the one who made it famous. When Salvatore Crazy Sal DiSarno was arrested and photographed shirtless in the Daily News, the cowboy skull was on his chest, and it was impossible to miss. Suddenly, New Yorkers connected the image to Tony's shop. But here's what most people don't know. Tony would have hated the nickname. He thought Sal was a nuisance, not someone worth attaching his work to. If you had called it a Crazy Sal in front of him, Tony would have yelled at you. For him, it was always the Rough Rider. This is why it matters to check lineage. Tattoo designs don't belong to one person. They travel, they evolve, they get renamed. Tony's Rough Rider sits in a long chain from Coleman to Spalding to Brooklyn to the world. And that chain tells you more about how traditional tattooing really worked than any single story can. Tony wasn't a machine builder like Paul Rogers or Huck Spalding. He tuned his machines, he kept them running, but he wasn't reinventing them. Sometimes he'd repeat the old-timer line that tattoo machines were just glorified doorbells, but that really wasn't his phrase. It was something a lot of the old tattooers said. What Tony did say, and what he believed, was that the machines and the designs were the most important part of the trade. Keep the machines running, keep the designs bold, and the work will stand. That was his philosophy. Part of Tony's charm is that he was a showman. He loved to keep his customers entertained, and sometimes that meant bending the truth. Rich Fie remembered one story. A client complimented Tony's neat handwriting on a name tattoo that he was supplying. Tony smiled and said, "I used to work at Carnival's, writing names on cakes." Later, Rich asked if that was true. Tony laughed and said, "No, I never worked there." That was Tony, fun-loving, quick with a line, willing to blur fact and fiction if it kept the chair lighthearted. And that same spirit carried into the nickname Old Calcutta. At first it was a jab, Walter Moskowitz joking that Tony's shop was as crowded and dirty as the Indian City. But Tony ran with it. He got it tattooed on himself by Tom DeVita. He wore a bracelet with the name. What started as a dig became a badge of honor. And that's another thing that I love about Tony. He was funny, he was quick, and he turned tattooing into theater. Compare that to today, where the model is private studios, books open at 8 a.m. and close at 8:30. Tony's world was the opposite. Volume was king. He made his living moving fast, keeping people laughing, and keeping the shop open. The shop was never officially called Old Calcutta. On paper, it was always Tony's Tattoos. But nicknames have power. Clients called it Old Calcutta, and soon so did Tony. When the doors finally closed in 2014, it marked the end of more than a storefront. It closed a chapter in New York tattoo history. Tony passed away in 2017, but the images, the flash, the stories, and the nickname still live on. Ask collectors today, and they'll tell you about Old Calcutta as if it were an institution, not just a shop. And in a way, it was. It was a place that survived the ban years, pushed out thousands of tattoos, and turned borrowed design into an icon. Tony Polito wasn't the first to draw the cowboy skull, and his shop was never really called Old Calcutta, but he made both of them legendary. For me, he represents a kind of tattooer you don't see much anymore. A self-taught grinder, even through the ban years, willing to tattoo 40 or 80 people in a day if that's what it took. He was tough, he was funny, and he kept the culture alive when almost nobody else in New York was still working. And part of why I wanted to make this video, honestly, is personal. I remember being in a shop in Portland, looking up at a flash wall, and seeing that skull in the cowboy hat. I knew what it was, the Rough Rider, the image Tony Polito made famous. But the artist there didn't. To him, it was just another piece of flash. That stuck with me. It weighed on me. Because if even tattooers were losing the thread, then how long before Tony's name disappeared completely? That moment is one of the reasons I started Skin and Story. To make sure the names, the flash, and the history stay connected. I've admired Tony since I first read that late 90s article about him. And the truth is, we're still feeling the impact of his choices. And the boldness of traditional flash, in the stories we tell, and in the fact that tattooing survived long enough to become what it is today. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Rich Fie for the use of his photos of Tony and for his help in my research. He's a stand-up dude and an amazing tattooist. His links are in the description. He has a ton of video and writing for those interested in learning more. Who are your favorite tattooists? Put them down in the comments and maybe I'll profile them. The legacy of traditional tattooing is in our skin and in our story. Thanks for being here.